Krivax glared at the village of Murlocs, situated on the smaller island south of the Isle of Spears, as he stood safely behind Masruk and the band of Tuskar composed of warriors from both Kamagwa and the nearby village of Iskal. Thankfully, they had been able to successfully ambush the group of patrolling Murlocs and hide without attracting attention. However, they did not have much time before the Murlocs discovered something was wrong, so they would need to act soon. The White Shark tribe's newest leader had recently been leading the Murlocs to attack Kamagwa's fishermen, and several Tuskar had already been killed. Murlocs had always been one of the deadliest threats that Kamagwa and Iskal faced at sea, but that threat had grown enough recently that the Tuskar had decided to launch an attack on the village that housed the tribe's chieftain. While Krivax and Masruk were not necessarily required to participate, Krivax found himself wanting to help despite the danger to himself. The Tuskar had treated him well, and Masruk had even become acquainted with one of the fishermen who had been killed. As far as he could tell, the Murlocs had no other intentions other than killing fishermen and stealing their food and equipment. When Krivax had asked One-Eye if diplomacy with the Murlocs was possible, the shaman merely looked at him strangely and told him that all the attempts that the Tuskar had made in the past had failed due to the frogmen's constant hostility. Krivax believed that if diplomacy were possible, then the peaceful Tuskar would have found a way to negotiate an agreement with them a long time ago. Since peace was not an option, then Krivax might as well help them fight. Besides, Kamagwa had agreed easily to arrange an introduction to the Moki clan without asking for anything in return, aside from the continuation of their trading agreement, so Krivax felt like he owed them one. Krivax could feel his tension increasing as Kaganut and Chieftain Notuk quietly gave instructions to the group of grim-faced Tuskar warriors. Once the Tuskar was sufficiently prepared, Kaganut turned his attention to Krivax and, with a determined expression, gave him a single nod, signaling that it was time to start the assault. Krivax returned the nod and telepathically directed the two flyers that were by his side to fly over the village. Once they were there, Krivax instructed them to drop the arcane silk bombs they were carrying, which resulted in an explosion of arcane energy that managed to injure several Murlocs and tangling up more in webbing. Krivax had spell-woven much more magic into those bombs than the ones he used when sparring with Masruk. While the Murlocs were disoriented and screaming amongst themselves in their strange language, Chieftain Otuk released a bellowing war cry and led the Tuskar warriors' charge on the village. While the chieftain was not Kamagwa's most powerful warrior, his leadership greatly increased the morale of the warriors present. Their speed increased dramatically as Elder One-Eye pounded her gnarled staff onto the ground and cast magic that increased the strength of the Tuskar warriors. Once that was done, the elderly woman began to throw bolts of lightning from her hands that instantly killed any Murloc that they hit. Masruk stood back to wait for an opportune moment. He would be able to charge much faster than the Tuskar, so it would be wise for him to wait as support. The charging Tuskars smashed into the confused Murlocs like an unstoppable wave of violence. The much heavier Tuskars pushed their way into the center of the village and began skewering Murlocs with their long spears or simply trampling them with their weight. While Murlocs were extremely dangerous and agile in the water, they were much less of a threat while on land. Krivax was casting frost bolts in the direction of the Murloc spellcasters when he felt the Murloc chieftain exit his hut and step onto the battlefield with a gurgling war cry. The Murlocs who had been panicking and were moments away from fleeing into the ocean suddenly attacked the Tuskar with a savage ferocity. The Murloc shamans also cast their own spells to increase the speed and strength of their own warriors, enhancing their own forces with magic while also blasting at the Tuskar with water and earth spells. Every Tuskar suddenly found themselves defending against 2 or 3 Murlocs who jumped at them with primitive weapons and razor-sharp teeth. The Murloc chieftain himself was a hulking creature who wielded a well-crafted harpoon that had obviously been stolen from a Tuskar. Chieftain Otuk and Kaganut immediately focused on trying to kill the Murloc chieftain, and Masruk charged at full speed and spear-first into the largest group of Murlocs. From there, Krivax lost himself in the tide of battle as he frantically cast frost bolts at any Murloc that he could. Several times, Murlocs turned their attention to him only to find themselves fixed to the ground by a well-timed frost nova and then quickly killed by Orphus, who had been assigned by the chieftain to protect him. Krivax distantly noted that the flyer he had sent to distract the Murloc chieftain during his battle had been killed. Finally, just as he was starting to tire and his ice barrier was beginning to strain from absorbing stray hits, the Murlocs broke and began wildly running to the ocean. Krivax turned his attention to the Murloc chieftain, only to see his corpse hanging from the end of Kaganut's spear. Krivax pushed down the bile at the back of his throat and made his way to Masruk. Once he verified that his friend was all right, Krivax moved to assist the Tuskar in tending to their wounded. Thankfully, Nerubian silk made for good battlefield bandages. A part of him had been expecting the Tuskar to celebrate their victory, but he saw nothing but solemn expressions on the Tuskar as they tore down the Murlocs' huts, recovered their stolen items, and collected their dead and wounded. As Krivax made his way back to Kamagwa with the rest of the group, he couldn't bring himself to stop thinking about the corpses of the dead Murlocs and Tuskars. It didn't help that some of those Murlocs had been killed by him personally. The moment Krivax realized where he had been reborn, he started to mentally prepare himself to witness scenes of violence, but watching a Murloc bite off pieces of a Tuskar was not something he was ready for. "Krivax, are you all right?" asked Orphus with a concerned expression on his face. "I am not well versed in your people's body language, but you seem uncomfortable." Masruk walked to his side, offering his silent support. "I'm all right, Orphus," said Krivax, attempting to reassure the Tuskar warrior. "I just was not fully prepared for that." "Was this your first real battle?" Orphus asked sympathetically. "Yes, but I'll be fine. I'll just have to get used to things like this." "I understand," Orphus said kindly. "Some of the younger warriors have trouble adjusting after their first battle as well. You're doing very well for your first time." "Thank you, Orphus. Just remember, while we should always strive for peace, sometimes there are no other options other than to fight," said Orphus. "When those times come, we must push aside our reservations and fight with all of our might to protect what we hold dear. The world would be a better place if more people were as empathetic as you, Krivax, but that is unfortunately not the world we live in." Krivax took a moment to absorb those words before thanking the Tuskar and turning his attention to his friend. "How are you feeling, Masruk?" "I am well," Masruk said evenly. "Warrior Nishamis made considerable efforts to acclimate me to such violence before I was allowed to go to the surface." Krivax didn't like the sound of that, but it was to be expected. Even though the warriors of Azul-Nerub had not experienced war for millennia, they still made active efforts to be ready for anything and dealt with the occasional outbreak of unfriendly underground creatures. According to Masruk, the warriors had even increased their training in recent years, though he did not know the reason. Soon enough, their group made their way back to the village and the surviving Tuskar warriors reunited with their worried families while the chieftain informed the families of the deceased about the fate of their loved ones. Thankfully, natural Tuskar hardiness meant there was nothing among the wounded that was so serious that required Wumnai's magical attention at this time. Krivax knew there was nothing for him to do here, so after telling Masruk where he was going, he decided to follow Wumnai as the old woman made her way to her home since she had not spoken at all after the battle was over and he was a little worried about her. Mana exhaustion was not an unknown thing among Nerubians after all, and given her advanced age, it might mean that Wumnai was very tired out after helping in battle. As he made his way through the village, Krivax made note of all the changes that had come to Kamagwa over the past month. Many of the villagers were now wearing clothing that was partially composed of flame-weave silk, and some of the buildings had even used silk to reinforce their structures. Krivax could also see many more metal tools than he remembered there being when he first arrived, and nearly every single boat near the docks contained nets and ropes made of Nerubian silk. Most importantly, those nets helped dramatically increase the amount of food that the fishermen could bring in. Until today, Krivax had watched as the Tuskar steadily grew happier as their standard of living increased due to their ability to trade with the Nerubians. The shellfish were well received by the leadership of Kilahuk, and Hadix had assigned most of his division's idle administrators to handle trade between Kamagwa and Kilahuk. There was even some attempt to expand upon the goods that were traded with the surface world in the form of useful herbs and other potential alchemical reagents from local flora and fauna. The skitterers that had been sent to Krivax were now almost permanently running spatial bags to and from Kamagwa, and the Surface World Research Division had more funding than ever before. It was a shame Krivax's status as a baseline Nerubian and his relative inexperience limited the number of flyers and skitterers that he could reliably control, even with the artifact. He would feel much safer if he had a swarm of the creatures protecting him at all times. There had been an attempt to use flyers to transport goods, But after the first few spatial bags were lost to wandering proto-dragons, Krivax decided it would be best if they stuck with the skitterers. Only time would tell how far this relationship would be able to grow. Krivax entered Elder Wumnai's home without announcing himself, as he had learned that the shaman was able to sense his approach. Once he saw her, he could see that the elder had just finished drinking some manner of potion and seemed to be gathering what looked to be items for a ritual. "It seems like you'll be able to watch one of our funeral ceremonies before you leave," said Wumnai after a moment of silence. "Leave? The spirits have informed me that Green Island will be arriving tomorrow," said Wumnai. "You have learned our language and earned our trust. Once Oamelek has finished his preparations, you will leave for Moki Harbor. Orphus will accompany you to facilitate the introductions." Krivax recognized Green Island as the name for the giant turtle that facilitated travel between Kamagwa and Moki Harbor. He didn't know who Oamelek was, but he assumed that they were the person who steered the turtle boat. Orphus being sent to accompany him was also no surprise. After the Tuskar understood how significant establishing trade relations with Kilahuk would be to their village, Orphus decided to engrave a spider in his tusks to commemorate their first meeting. For some reason that Krivax did not understand, that seemed to be enough for the Tuskar elders to favor sending him to deal with Nerubian-related affairs. The day after Hadix had ordered Krivax to make finding evidence of the lands across the sea his priority, he had gone to Wumnai and the chieftain and requested their aid. While Wumnai was a bit suspicious and insistent on Krivax learning their language, they both had ultimately agreed to arrange for introductions with the Moki clan so that he could ask them about the foreigners who they traded with. Unfortunately, neither one of them knew exactly when Green Island would return, since it left not long before Krivax and Masruk showed up. Apparently, it took representatives from the other Tuskar villages home after a visit to Kamagwa, so he had been forced to wait in Kamagwa until the turtle arrived. Thankfully, despite his earlier intensity, Vizier Hadix seemed willing to wait and was much more patient than Krivax expected. However, he had not forgotten the Vizier's threat to find the evidence himself without giving any regard to their relations with the Tuskar, so Krivax had been growing more and more anxious with each day that Green Island failed to arrive. But now, the turtle boat was finally about to arrive, and the time for Krivax to depart from Kamagwa was fast approaching. It was a bittersweet feeling. He would miss giving rides to Kafue and relaxing with the peaceful and kind villagers, but he knew that it was time for him to move on. "Thank you," Krivax said in gratitude, bowing despite the shaman's distaste for formality. "We appreciate the help you've given us, and both I and Masruk have enjoyed the time we've spent in Kamagwa." "You say that as if you're never going to return," Wumnai said with a scoff. "With trade between our people continuing to increase, I doubt this is the last we'll see of one another." Krivax sincerely hoped that to be true. If it were not for the looming threat of the Lich King, he wouldn't mind continuing to spend time in Kamagwa. "One day, I'll come back here," Krivax vowed to himself. "Come with me," said Wumnai as she began to walk out of the house. "You fought side by side with our warriors. You should watch as their spirits are guided to their statues." Krivax followed the shaman as she slowly walked through the village and made her way to the families of the deceased. He watched as Masruk and the surviving Tuskar warriors helped the families gather some personal effects to place next to the large stone head statues of the deceased. The bodies themselves had already been taken elsewhere so that the families were not forced to see them. Tuskar believed that it was not good for families to see the bodies of their loved ones if they were in poor condition. They instead preferred to visit them at their statues and remember them as they were. The walk to the statues was a short one as they were placed in a nearby quarry so that the villagers could more easily reach them. It also helped that the materials to build new statues were also within reach. The closer Krivax got to the statues, the stranger things started to feel to his magical senses. The energy that was given off by the statues did not feel like anything Krivax had ever felt before, and it gave him the impression of almost being alive. He could even feel one of the statues in particular scrutinize both him and Masruk as they drew closer. He dearly hoped that the Tuskar ghosts living in the statues had a good impression of him. Thankfully, whichever spirits were responsible for guarding this place had either already been informed about him and Masruk, or they were able to sense the lack of hostility the living Tuskar had towards them. Once everyone arrived at the quarry, Chieftain Otuk did not waste any time before starting the funeral proceedings. The first parts of the funeral were remarkably normal, in that the families were invited to say good things about the departed in front of everyone and then present the sentimental items that would be placed next to their statues. Krivax was half expecting the objects to be favored weapons, given that all three of the deceased were warriors, but Orpheus informed him that their weapons would be left for their descendants. Until recently, the Tuskar did not have enough metal for them to be able to justify losing perfectly good weapons and tools. Once each of the families was finished presenting their items and telling stories about their loved ones, Elder Wamni stepped forward to oversee the next part of the ceremony. The bodies of the deceased, who were covered with blankets made of animal hides so that the families would not see them, were brought before the old shaman as she prepared her ritual tools. Krivax watched with rapt fascination as Wamni began to chant in a strange rhythmic language that he did not recognize. It sounded nothing at all like the Tuskar language, and Krivax felt himself grow curious about its origins. The only part of the chant that Krivax could understand was the frequent calls to Karkut, the Tuskar god of the dead. He couldn't help but feel distinctly uncomfortable as translucent figures began to rise from the corpses of the deceased and floated into their respective statues. Krivax found himself wondering what, if anything, separated this from necromancy. Once the ritual was complete and the spirits were safely transported to their statues, it felt to Krivax as if the entire quarry was gleefully welcoming the newly arrived Tuskar. As the families went to speak with the statues of their loved ones and Krivax and Masruk followed everyone else back to the village, Krivax felt conflicted. Although attending a funeral was a morbid end to his stay in Kamagwa, he was grateful that he had been allowed to attend. Not only had the unusual ritual been strangely beautiful in its own way, but it had shown him that despite his meta-knowledge, he truly knew little about this world and its magic. Krivax wished he was able to stay in Kamagwa longer and learn more about their magic and statues. I really hope that I'm able to keep my vow to return here one day. Krivax had gravely underestimated how boring a trip out to sea would be, especially one that lasted several weeks. When Green Island first arrived in Kamagwa, he had been filled with a sense of awe by the turtle's massive size and the wisdom held in its eyes. His farewells to the villagers had been met with expressions of gratitude, well wishes, and tearful goodbyes in the case of Kafu. While Krivax had felt sentimental about his departure from Kamagwa, he had also felt excited and optimistic about beginning the next portion of his journey. Now, after a little over 2 weeks of having nothing to do besides continuing his studies in spatial magics, his excitement had completely dissipated. Krivax was confident now that he was ready to attempt short-range teleportation, or blinking as it was called, but the back of a giant turtle in the middle of an Arctic sea was not the appropriate place to test such magic. Krivax idly noted Orpheus glancing at him worriedly as he released a forlorn sigh. At least we should be arriving at Moki Harbor today, according to Oamalik. During the trip, Krivax had exhausted every question he could think of to ask Orpheus about what they should expect when they arrived in Moki Harbor. Orpheus admitted that the Moki would likely be similarly startled by the appearance of the Nerubians, just as he had been. His plan to avoid any unnecessary violence would be for Krivax and Masruk to simply hide away in the cabin while he explained things to them. Orpheus felt like this was absolutely necessary, because the Tuskar of Dragonblight were notably more militaristic than their counterparts in the Howling Fjord. They were still a friendly people who were prone to seeking a peaceful resolution to their problems, but the increased risk of attacks from Wolver, Yeti, and Prides of Magnator had certainly affected their culture. There was a real risk that the Tuskar would attack the two Nerubians if they were not warned about them beforehand. "Krivax, is everything all right?" asked Orpheus, visibly concerned. "Yes, I'm fine. I'm just not used to such long trips," said Krivax. "Do you know how much longer we have until we arrive?" "Well, according to Oamalik, we could soon see Moki Harbor appearing over the horizon at any moment," said Orpheus reassuringly. "You should enjoy the trip while you can, Krivax. Being surrounded by the ocean is an amazing experience." "I'm afraid I don't quite share your enthusiasm," Krivax said wryly as he glanced at the water surrounding the turtle boat. "My people are not as well suited for the water as your own." Attempting to swim with a Nerubian body was not an experience that Krivax particularly enjoyed. Masruk seemed to enjoy swimming, but Krivax suspected his friends saw it as a challenge to overcome. Krivax tried to pass the time with Orpheus by making small talk, but unfortunately, they had already exhausted all topics of conversation that they could think of over the trip. Krivax was considering whether or not he should follow Masruk's example and weave a web that he could fall asleep on with the pair of flyers that he had brought, when his silent prayers were seemingly heard. "We are nearly there. The broken pillars peek over the horizon," shouted Oamalik from his position at the top of the deck. Krivax eagerly skittered to the front of the deck and directed his gaze to the direction Oamalik was pointing. Sure enough, he could see the enormous shattered pillars of the Path of the Titans off in the distance. Krivax woke up Masruk, who was not as excited about looking at giant broken pillars as he was. As Green Island grew closer and closer to the ancient structures, Krivax felt a sense of awe as their true size became apparent. "I really wish I could take a picture of this. I wonder if the gnomes have invented anything like cameras yet." Once they passed the Path of the Titans, it was only a short while before they could see the kites flying over Moki Harbor in the distance. "All right, you two, I think it's time for you to go below deck," said Orpheus. "I'll yell for you to come out after I'm done warning the Moki, and it's safe for you two to show yourselves." Krivax and Masruk both nodded their agreement and made their way below deck with the two flyers, where they were keeping the trading supplies. Kamagwa and Icecarl had both purchased large amounts of goods from Killerhook that they intended to resell to the Tuskar of Dragonblight at a markup. The Nerubians were unable to trade directly with Moki Harbor or the nearby village of Endul because the closest Nerubian city was Azjol-Nerub's capital city. Vizier Hadix had made some perfunctory attempts to convince the circle of viziers in the capital to allow for trade to take place from their city, but Krivax could tell that his heart was not in it. The capital city was the center of isolationist sentiment in the kingdom and rarely allowed anyone to use their gate to the surface for any reason. Besides, as far as Vizier Hadix was concerned, if a trade route was established between the capital and Dragonblight's Tuskar, then his division wouldn't be the ones profiting from it. Krivax was not too concerned one way or another. He understood that sapient greed would eventually push Azjol-Nerub to open itself up once the benefits of doing so grew too large to ignore. If he was actually able to successfully establish a trading relationship with civilizations that could offer more than luxury food goods, then Azjol-Nerub's time as a completely isolated kingdom was destined to become history. Krivax and Masruk waited patiently below deck as Green Island pulled into port. Soon he was able to hear the voices of unfamiliar Tuskar men, so he assumed that the guards had arrived. The conversation between Orpheus and the Moki clan's guards went on long enough for Krivax to begin growing nervous, but he eventually heard Orpheus yelling for the two of them to come out onto the deck. Krivax tentatively made his way up onto the deck, followed by Masruk, and was immediately met with the shocked yells of frightened Tuskar warriors. As the leader of the Tuskar attempted to calm down his men, Krivax took a moment to look over the warriors. They seemed similar enough to warriors of Kamagwa, given that they all wielded spears and were covered in various pieces of leather armor, but there were some differences as well. The litany of scars that covered each of their bodies made it easy to tell that these warriors saw more frequent combat than the warriors of Kamagwa. Many of those scars were likely made by the Wolver, given that they seemed to have been made by claws and fangs. "Greetings, warriors of Moki Harbor," Krivax said as soon as the Tuskar managed to calm talk enough for them to hear him. "I am Krivax, and my companion is Masruk. We have come to your village with peaceful intentions toward your people and hope for the same. We present this fresh catch to you as a gift and proof of our character." Krivax finished up his speech by reaching into his spatial bag and pulling out an emperor's salmon within a silk net to hold out to the group of Tuskar. Since it worked the first time, he figured it only made sense to catch something the day they were expected to arrive to give to this new group. The Tuskar looked between each other, likely dumbfounded that they were currently being addressed by a giant spider person. After a few awkward moments, one of the Tuskar warriors stepped forward to address him. Krivax assumed that they were the leader of the group. "Welcome to Moki Harbor, outsiders. I am Sheikh Hukka," said the Tuskar warrior with an accent that Krivax found strange. "I confess, I had not quite believed the words of the warrior from Kamagwa. But if you offer no threat to the people of this village, then you are both welcome here, and your gift of the sea's bounty is gladly accepted," he said as he took the net bag from Krivax's hands. "Thank you, Sheikh Hukka," said Krivax. "I am glad to see that the Kaluak of the Moki clan are as kind and welcoming as those in Kamagwa and Icecarl. I greatly enjoyed the time I spent in Kamagwa and look forward to being able to see your village as well. I have heard that it is quite beautiful." Krivax did not hear anything of the kind. but his flattering words had the intended effect of causing the Tuskar warriors to release most of their tension and puff up in pride. "You heard correctly, outsider," said Sheikaka. "Come with me. I shall escort you all to the chieftain so that you can make your introductions." "Before we go, there is one other matter," said Orpheus, interrupting the warriors as they were about to escort them to the village. "Kamagwa has sent many more items than usual that they wish to use to trade with the Moki clan and in Jewel Village. I would request that some of your warriors aid us in removing them from Green Island." "Of course," Sheikaka said indulgently. "How many warriors do you need? 1? 2? I think it would be best if I showed you so that you could make your own judgment," said Orpheus after a moment of hesitation. Sheikaka raised a bushy eyebrow but said nothing as he accompanied Orpheus onto the turtle boat, hesitating only slightly as he passed the 2 Nerubians, and followed him below deck. The Tuskar warrior bellowed in surprise when he saw stacks upon stacks of silken boxes filled with ores. "What is all this?" "These are items that Kamagwa acquired through trading with the Nerubians," said Orpheus, only a little smugly. "The rolls of silk possess properties that make them perfect for weaving sturdy nets, ropes, and even clothes to keep you warm during the winter. The Nerubians are also able to produce large amounts of metal ore. Kamagwa is able to acquire more than enough of these for its needs, so our elders decided to send a portion to Moki Harbor for trade." The next time Sheikaka turned his gaze to Krivax and Masruk, his expression was one that was filled with greed rather than apprehension. "I see," said Sheikaka, obviously struggling to remain calm. "I will have all of my men help in bringing these items to the village." Krivax and Masruk spent the next few minutes helping the Tuskar unload all of the trading goods from Green Island. While they were doing this, Sheikaka said some quiet words to one of the younger Tuskar warriors which sent the boy running back to the village. Krivax assumed he would be informing the village leadership about what was happening so that they would have time to prepare for their arrival. Once they were done, each of the warriors carried a box of valuable trading goods as Sheikaka led them into the village from their wooden docks. Krivax kept the 2 flyers close to him in order to avoid frightening any of the villagers. He had left behind the skitterers so that they could save space on Green Island and so that they could continue carrying trading goods. Hadix indicated he would be willing to send more if they were needed, but Krivax felt like the flyers were enough for now. The shocked faces of the villagers as they gawped at the 2 Nerubians made Krivax feel a small sense of nostalgia for the first moment he walked into Kamagwa. He couldn't help but send a friendly wave to a young Tuskar calf who was staring at him with her mouth open. Krivax chuckled as the young Tuskar girl jerked in surprise and hid shyly behind who he assumed to be her mother. While Moki Harbor seemed to be larger than Kamagwa, the village seemed to be less prosperous than Kamagwa was, even before they began to trade with Killer Hook. This did not particularly surprise Krivax given that the climate of Dragonblight was much harsher than that of the Howling Fjord. There was noticeable damage on more than a few of the buildings, likely from past attacks, that has been repaired over and over again. Krivax even could see some Tuskar working to fix a hole in the outer walls with wood and whalebone. The whole place had a more fortified look to it, which made sense given that unlike the Isle of Spears, threats from the land could, and apparently did, happen regularly. Their group reached the chieftain's home fairly quickly since the building was very close to the harbor. Once they were there, Sheikaka instructed the Nerubians and Orpheus to wait outside while he spoke with the chieftain. After a few moments, the Tuskar warrior reappeared and escorted Krivax into the building. The first thing that Krivax noted when they entered the building was that the Tuskar chieftain was the largest Tuskar that he had ever seen. The man was huge, well-muscled, possessed a large magnificent mustache, and had the Tuskar symbol for chieftain proudly carved into his enormous tusks. The second thing that he noted was that the shamans of the Moki clan seemed to wield spears rather than staves like the shamans of Kamagwa and Iskal. Krivax assumed that there was a greater emphasis on these shamans being able to fight than there was on the Isle of Spears. Krivax felt like he would have a difficult time telling the difference between a shaman and a warrior in this village if he had not learned how to interpret the symbols Tuskar carved into their tusks. Well, that and the magic he could feel radiating from their bodies. Once everyone finished entering the building, the massive Tuskar began to speak in a deep voice. "Greetings, outsiders. I am Chieftain Kanoni. These are Elders Sigo, Dutni, and Toa. Please introduce yourselves." "Well met, Chieftain Kanoni," said Orpheus. "I am Orpheus, warrior of Kamagwa. These are Krivax and Masruk, two Nerubians who have proven themselves to be friends of Kamagwa and Iskal. They have expressed an interest in traveling to Moki Harbor, and I joined them with the intention of both facilitating introductions and arranging for trade between our villages. Nerubians? Questioned Kanoni. The chieftain turned his gaze to the elders, but they all shook their heads. I have never heard of your people, and it seems my elders have not either. Tell me about your people, Nerubians. Of course, chieftain, said Krivax. He spent the next hour giving the chieftain and the elders an abridged introduction to Azjol Nerub and its society, much like the one he had given Chieftain Otuk and Elder Wumnai. It took quite a while for him to finish because the chieftain and his elders interrupted periodically to ask pointed questions, and Orphus also interrupted to tell them about all of the benefits the Isle of Spears had received from trading with the Nerubians. Krivax suspected that the large amounts of goods that had been brought to the village had done much more to convince the chieftain of the benefits of cooperation. When he was done speaking, Kanoni seemed to be much more enthusiastic about their presence than Otuk had been. If you are able to help my people as much as Orphus claims, then you will always be welcome here, Nerubians, said Chieftain Kanoni. Would your people be interested in trading for shellfish from us as well as Kamagwa? Yes, chieftain, said Krivax. Azjol Nerub was massive in comparison to the Tuskar villages and would be more than capable of taking any amount of shellfish that the Tuskar would be able to produce. Unfortunately, this trade would need to take place using Kamagwa and Iskal as an intermediary. Oh? Why is that? Asked Kanoni, visibly displeased. Krivax explained to the chieftain that Killerhook was too far from his village for trade to be easy and that he would not be able to get permission to travel to the surface from the city nearest to his village. The chieftain did not like it but seemed to accept it once everything was fully explained to him. At least we still have something to trade even if we have to go through Kamagwa and Iskal, said Elder Toa. This Azjol Nerub seems to only be interested in shellfish and herbs. I doubt Indule has anything you Nerubians would be interested in. I wouldn't be so sure, said Elder Sigo, turning a shrewd gaze to Krivax's spatial pouch. At her words, all of the elders turned their attention to the spatial pouch, or more accurately, to the magic it was emanating. This magic feels similar to the magic of the Lithala woodlands, said Elder Duakni. The Lithala woodlands? Asked Krivax. It had been a long time since he had played World of Warcraft, and he wasn't sure what the elders were talking about. Indule village is built along a lake that is the end point of a long river of magic similar to the magic coming from your bag, explained Elder Sigo. This river of magic has altered the very life of the nearby woods. I suspect that the trees and animals of these woods could be useful to your people. She's talking about a ley line. If there is truly a ley line running under the Lithala woodlands, then I'm sure there are plenty of things in there that the Circle of Viziers would be interested in. Although shellfish were spreading quickly in Killerhook, and were starting to disseminate into the rest of Azjol Nerub, interest in the surface had still only moderately increased within the Circle of Viziers. This was because many of the viziers looked down on shellfish as a novelty and a luxury good that did little to tangibly benefit the kingdom, according to Vizier Hadix. If Indule were able to provide large amounts of magical reagents, then interest in the surface would increase significantly within the Circle of Viziers, and hopefully the rest of the kingdom. That sounds like something my people would be extremely interested in, said Krivax, barely holding back his excitement. I'm glad to hear that, said Chieftain Kanoni. But you can negotiate an agreement with Indule later. For now, I believe it best if we come to an agreement over the goods that were brought today, so that they can start helping my people. The Wolva have grown aggressive recently. Well, more so than usual, and I want those ores delivered to our blacksmiths as quickly as possible. Before we start the negotiations, there is something I need to ask you, Chieftain Kanoni, said Krivax. I was told by Elder Wumnai of Kamagwa that your people sometimes trade with people from lands from across the sea. Is that true? Yes, it is, said Chieftain Kanoni, growling slightly at the change in subject. Why do you ask? Just a topic I wish to speak about in more detail with you. After the trade talks, of course, Krivax said quickly. I understand your urgency. Very well, we will speak more on the topic later then, the chieftain said. Now as to the goods in question. Krivax nodded his agreement and settled in for another long trade negotiation. Thankfully, Orphus would be the primary negotiator this time, as the goods technically belong to Kamagwa and Iskal now. As the negotiations dragged on, Krivax privately hoped that the Surface World Research Division would soon transition to using currency for all of their trading needs. Things would be much easier if they didn't need to figure out how many lobsters a piece of iron or the size of an average Tuskar fist was worth. Barter may be the oldest form of trading, but it could get annoying at times and was terribly inefficient.